Hi everyone, welcome to my new episode of my podcast. Although it's March 1st as I'm recording this, March is known as the Women's History Month. I will also touch base on a few other topics that I believe are all interrelated on so many levels. These topics include the Black History Month, which was February yesterday. I'm a day late, but it's worth celebrating. I will touch base on the Vietnam War and how Laos, where I came from, play a role in it. Ukraine, and then my personal thoughts and connections to these events. There will be 3 parts to this episode. And for the most part, I will read directly from the sources I found my research on because I feel it's crucial to take in all the facts and figures that applies. I don't want to change something if it's been well thought out and well written. So because of that, I will read verbatim from the sources that I found these subject matters. And aside from that, I'll share my own opinions, like I said. As always, I am not here to advocate any political agendas or views, simply sharing my own opinions in areas that have touched my own personal life. I am an advocate for human rights and equal rights to live as humans without the fear of racism, prejudice, discrimination because of the color of our skin, our ethnicity, or religion. Having lived the life I have, I've gone through so many experiences and witnessed so much pain and suffering along the way. I am only here to share how history and human nature can repeat itself, or it can be altered by our choices alone. As I'm sitting here in front of my desk, contemplating about the contents I want to create for this podcast, I am in awe of nature's beauty in my backyard. I am sitting inside the comfort of my own home, having the freedom to work from home and working on my goals and dreams of writing, creating a voice through my podcast. And it hits me that there's a war going on across the other side of the globe, in Ukraine. How conflicting is life? How can I be living in harmony when others are trying to survive? It doesn't make things easy. There's so much suffering going on all around us in one form or another, even locally. What can you do? At this point, I can only bring attention to the problem so we can, in unison, share our concerns and voice our opinions, whether it's related to Ukraine, racism, poverty, homelessness, other subject matters that's currently taking place. I'm going to start off by touching on an area that is close to my own life, the Vietnam War, and how Laos was a part of all this big chaos, big mess of a crisis. Yesterday, I received a phone call from another broker in the Orlando area, looking to give me a referral because his client speaks only Lao or Thai as his native tongue. Although he's been in the U.S. for over 40 years, like myself, his English is not fluent. He's in his late 60s. They tried to use his younger sister as a translator, but she doesn't speak the native tongue as well, not well enough to discuss the contracts, the current market trend, and everything related to the complicated real estate process. The other realtor found me through his research on a local Realtors Association website, where there are over 20,000 agents just here in Central Florida. This is a very huge market because we have over 293,000 active licensees across the state of Florida. I am lucky to be multilingual. I was able to communicate with the gentleman, and we're working on finding him a home in the near future. The client is of Hmong descent. Why is that important? Hmong people are among the largest tribal groups in Laos. There are over 160 ethnic subgroups in Laos that have their own languages, but only 49 groups are officially recognized by the Laos government. The Hmong people were descendants from China that had migrated to Laos, but they were not seen as equals to the Lao lowlanders. During the Vietnam War, the Royal Laos Army and the United States used these tribal people to their advantage. They fought in the war and lost more lives than any other groups in Laos. They were promised to be saved when the U.S. pulled out of Laos after the communists took over. But no one went back for them. They were left to be captured and slaughtered like animals. Some tried to escape, but most didn't make it. These were the same people that I saw floating along the Mekong River when my own family flee from the wrath of the war. Even in the U.S., they are still seen by many Laotians as subordinates. The women have it worse. The women in their group are seen less than equals within their own communities. I bring this up because it shows how inhumane people treat other people based on their race and ethnicities. Although on paper they are technically Laotian, they are not accepted as Laotian. They are like the nomads in the Sahara Desert who has no place to call home. It is unfortunate. More importantly, I want to mention that during the Vietnam War, Laos was used as a training ground. Devastating is an understatement when I learned that Laos was the most bombed country in the world. I will read from the research done by the Legacy of War website, Secret War in Laos. From 1964 to 1973, the U.S. dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos during $580,000 bombing missions, equal to a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years. Again, they dropped over 580,000 bombing missions, which is like for 24 hours a day for 9 years, they were bombing a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes. I had to repeat that because that is, I can't even imagine. It's just insurmountable. Making Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. The bombings were part of the U.S. Secret War in Laos to support the Royal Lao government against the Pathet Lao and to interdict traffic along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The bombings destroyed many villages and displaced hundreds of thousands of Lao civilians during the 9-year period. Up to a third of the bombs dropped did not explode, leaving Laos contaminated with vast quantities of unexploded ordnance, which is abbreviated as UXO. Over 20,000 people have been killed or injured by UXO in Laos since the bombing ceased. The wounds of war are not only felt in Laos. When the Americans withdrew from Laos in 1973, hundreds of thousands of refugees fled the country, and many of them ultimately resettled in the United States. Here are some facts and figures. Over 270 million cluster bombs were dropped on Laos during the Vietnam War, which is 210 million more bombs than were dropped on Iraq in 1991, 1998, and 2006 combined. Up to 80 million did not detonate. Nearly 40 years on, less than 1% of these munitions have been destroyed. More than half of all confirmed cluster munitions casualties in the world have occurred in Laos. Each year, there are now just under 50 new casualties in Laos, down from 310 in 2008. Close to 60% of the accidents result in death, and 40% of the victims are children. Between 1993 and 2016, the U.S. contributed, on average, $4.9 million per year for UXO clearance in Laos. The U.S. spent $13.3 million per day in 2013, in the year of 2013 dollars for 9 years bombing in Laos. Let me read that again. Between 1993 and 2016, the U.S. contributed to an average of $4.9 million per year for the clearance, for these UXO clearance in Laos. But they spent $13.3 million per day for 9 years bombing Laos. I can't fathom that. In just 10 days of bombing Laos, the U.S. spent $130 million. This is based on a 2013 currency or rate, or more than it has spent to clean up over the past 24 years. So they spent about $118 million as of 2013 to clean up all the bombs there, or the bombs that were still undetonated. But they spent $130 million in just 10 days. So those are some huge numbers to try to wrap your mind around it. I can't. I'll continue with part 2 in the next episode, and that would be in celebration of Black History Month. Part 2, Ocoee Massacre. Continuing with the subject matter of race and ethnicity, war, greed, power, I want to share what I learned from watching a documentary about the former Black slaves in Ocoee, Florida. The horrific incident was later called the Ocoee Massacre. The gruesome massacre took place 100 years ago during the presidential election period on November 2nd, 1920. The Black people that lived in Ocoee were all free slaves that had moved to Ocoee from mostly Georgia and the Carolinas to look for new place to live and to make more money for themselves to support their family. So they left the cotton fields and found the orange groves in Central Florida. I will read some clips written in the Orlando Sentinel. This is the official narrative of the terror for decades. It was obscured or excused by a whitewashing of facts by Stephen Hodak. He wrote this in the Orlando Sentinel on October 30th, 2020. Alan Franks was just 18 when he led 5 siblings hand in hand and carried a 6th, his disabled brother, on his back through swampy woods out of Ocoee, away from a mob of white men firing rifles and burning Black homes 100 years ago on election night. The kids followed the getaway plan their parents made in the wake of Ku Klux Klan marches just weeks earlier in Orlando, Winter Garden, and Ocoee as a warning to Blacks thinking of voting in that year's presidential election, said Gladys Franks Bell, Alan's daughter. They knew trouble was coming, said Bell, now 81 and living in Plymouth. That same night, November 2nd, 1920, J. Carl Devine's grandparents, John and Roxy Williams, escaped the violence by horse and buggy. John held the reins up front, while Roxy, lighter-skinned than her husband, sat in the back, their children clinging to her. If anyone stopped them, Devine, now 77, said, in the dark, they'd think she was a white woman and let them on their way. You had to be clever to survive, he said. It's taken a century, but family tales of the massacre, passed down by survivors through at least 3 generations, are at last shaping the official narrative of the terror that, for decades, was obscured or excused by a whitewashing of facts. Public officials, as well as the Orlando Sentinel and other accounts, for years referred to the violence as a race riot, often implying that the Black community itself caused the violence, rather than were the victims of it. By the time the flames died out and the shooting stopped, the Black neighborhood was a gruesome cremation scene, according to the Orlando Morning Sentinel, which reported 2 white deaths and an unknown number of Black residents dead or missing. Today, what happened in Central Florida 100 years ago is more frequently called what it was: a massacre, instigated by a white mob who wanted to send a message to Black voters. Historians say the deputized mob and white volunteers burnt 25 Black homes, 2 churches, and a fraternal lodge. The total number dead is still unknown. The lynching of Julius, quote-unquote, July Perry, 50, made him the best-known victim of one of the worst episodes of Election Day violence in the nation's history. He was a farmer and labor broker who dared register fellow Blacks to vote. His prosperity, civic activities, and fearlessness likely put him in the mob's crosshairs, said Sharon Cooley McWhite, an Orange County teacher and great niece to Perry, whom she honored during early voting in Orlando by wearing a t-shirt bearing his image to the polls. He was lynched, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had done everything right, she said. Even Perry's death certificate attempted to conceal the role of race in his murder, noting the cause was, quote-unquote, by lynching hung, not by violence caused by racial disturbance. While some facts remain in dispute, loss to time, poor record keeping, or intentional obfuscation, the story of how hundreds of Black families were driven from a West Orange County community is now viewed as so unjust and horrific that it's become the subject of a formal letter of apology from the city of Ocoee to be offered to descendants and a historic marker planned for the city's popular park at Stark Lake. This year, the Florida legislature ordered the tragedy to be written into the textbooks of school children, and the most in-depth exhibit ever curated on the tragedy is on display now at the Orange County Regional History Center. Belle, who told of her father's escape from the massacre in a book titled Visions Through My Father's Eyes, said he was a religious man who lived after the massacre in the Plymouth area in northwest Orange County, without malice for anyone, Black or white. Regardless of what happened in Ocoee, he told us, don't hold hate in your heart. No good comes from it, she said. Most research suggests the white attack on the neighborhood was sparked by a Black man's determination to vote and the angry response of some whites, fearful of losing ground financially and politically to an emancipated people enslaved a half-century earlier. An exact account of what happened in the community 13 miles west of Orlando may be impossible to tell today because of scarce and contradictory sources and distinctly separate perspectives, one white and one Black, said Claire Strom, a Rollins College history professor who co-authored an examination of the ugly episode published in 2014 in the Florida Historical Quarterly. Kenneth Thompson, a descendant of a Black Ocoee family that escaped the violence by hiding in a white neighbor's barn, said tongue-in-cheek that he believes in 2 versions, too, a fabricated one and the truth. I'll leave it up to you to decide which is which. Pam Schwartz, chief curator at the Orange County Regional History Center, says local authorities and others try to erase the memory of the Ocoee massacre. They just want it to go away like it never happened, she said. For the past 3 years, Pam Schwartz, chief curator of the Orange County Regional History Center, and her staff probed the tragedy, piecing together land records, tracing genealogies, recording oral histories, and culling published accounts. This work makes up an exhibit called Ocoee, Yesterday, This Was Home. Schwartz concluded local authorities, all white at the time, tried to hide the truth and managed to do so for decades. It's white erasure, she said. They just wanted it to go away like it never happened. It all started on November 2nd, 1920, when Moses Norman, a black labor broker, attempted to vote at a precinct in what would just 5 years later become the city of Ocoee. He was turned away by white poll workers. They said he had not paid his $1 poll tax, a voting obstacle that wouldn't be outlawed until 1964 by the 24th Amendment. He returned later in a car, but was turned away again. There was a gun in his vehicle, according to reports at the time. After the polls closed, a group of armed white men went into a black neighborhood to the home of Perry, Norman's friend, possibly to look for Norman. Writer Zora Neale Hurston later described Norman as the match to touch off the explosion. The deputized mob was led by Samuel T. Salisbury, who studied at West Point and served briefly as Orlando police chief and later 2 terms as Ocoee mayor in the 1950s. Salisbury, who had left a pregnant wife in labor at home, was shot in the arm when he shoved aside a rifle held by Perry's teen daughter, Coretha, who then was wounded in an exchange of gunfire. More shooting erupted, and soon some houses were on fire. 2 posse members were shot to death. Also severely wounded, Perry was captured in a sugarcane patch and brought to a cell at the Orange County Jail in downtown Orlando. According to a coroner's inquest, a white mob overpowered a jailer, took Perry from custody, brutalized and lynched him, then left his body hanging in public view near the Orlando home of federal judge John M. Chaney. The judge had advised Perry and Norman on voting rights. He resided near Lake Concord on West Colonial Drive, an area today where Interstate 4 passes over Colonial. 2 months earlier, the KKK sent a copy of a letter to Chaney, warning that interfering with white supremacy would have quote-unquote consequences. Perry was buried in Orlando's Greenwood Cemetery in an unmarked grave. Norman fled. He was later documented as living in New York City. The handwritten burial at Greenwood Cemetery in Orlando shows July Perry's unique entry. His death listed as due to quote-unquote lynching. Newspaper ads then summoned the region's World War I veterans to come to Ocoee to prevent more violence, and in effect blocked black residents who survived the terror-filled night from returning to homes they owned. Many fled, never to return. Those who came back were eventually driven away by violence that included dynamite thrown into their homes, Schwartz said, citing newspaper accounts. By late November, a dinner at the San Juan Hotel in downtown Orlando honored a white ex-serviceman who helped law enforcement restore order in Ocoee after the brief outburst of passion over the killing of 2 white men. Perry's lynching was shrugged off. The Orlando Morning Sentinel quoted jail doctors saying, Perry was expected to die at any moment anyway. Schwartz said the anti-black terror in the region didn't stop after election night. About 8 months after Perry's lynching, his brother-in-law, George Betsy, who had moved to Paramore, was taken into custody by Orlando police for alleged bootlegging. but was snatched from 2 arresting officers by a mob of 15 armed men. A 1921 newspaper account said he was found the next day alive, but chained to a light post, painted from the waist up with red and white stripes, his head tied in a sack. The account said he had talked too much about the trouble at Ocoee. The aftermath. According to the 1920 U.S. Census, 560 whites and 255 blacks lived in Ocoee. Schwartz said History Center research shows 24 blacks owned land there, with 42 properties among them. She said some black residents had been in the region since the 1880s and had accumulated invaluable wealth, including both Perry and Norman, owner of a productive grove. The combined value of those black-owned properties today is estimated at $9 million, she said. Every black person living in Ocoee lost something that night, Schwartz said. Of the 25 homes, 2 churches, and a fraternal lodge destroyed by mob fires. What took nearly 40 years to build was lost over a span of just 6 years in the wake of the massacre. Census takers counted 2 blacks remaining in Ocoee in 1930 and none from 1940 to 1970. The 1980 census counted 29. Most black property owners abandoned or sold their holdings after the massacre, many at high discounts. Among officials who helped to wrest land from black owners was Bluford M. Sims, a Confederate veteran considered an Ocoee founder and credited with naming it. He was appointed to oversee the land transaction and had placed an ad in the paper that read, "Special bargains. Several beautiful little groves belonging to the Negroes that just left Ocoee must be sold. C.B.M. Sims, Ocoee." Lester J. Dabbs, Jr., who penned a thesis about the massacre in 1969 to earn a master's degree in education from Stetson University, and also later served as Ocoee mayor, noted that a sign near the city limits once warned Negroes and dogs were unwelcome. "We all heard little bits and pieces about Ocoee growing up," said Francina Boykin, now 70, a black woman who co-founded the multiracial Democracy Forum and was a member of Apopka Memorial High School's second integrated graduating class. "What I thought I knew was bad, very bad," she said. "But when I learned the actual truth, it was worse, far worse." Francina Boykin visits the Ocoee Massacre exhibit at the Orange County Regional History Center. "When I learned the actual truth, it was worse, far worse," she says of the tragedy. The city today boasts a diversity board and invested $45,000 to plan a week-long 100-year remembrance during the first week of November, with hopes of providing descendants with formal letters of apology. City leaders also intend to unveil on November 8th a permanent historical marker at Stark Lake, its most popular gathering place. Among blacks, Ocoee has served as a cautionary tale for half a century, said Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings. Demings, who is black and also the first person to hold all 3 roles of Orlando Police Chief, Orange County Sheriff, and now County Mayor, said his father moved to Central Florida from Alabama in the 1930s and advised his children to be careful about venturing into Ocoee. It had a history that they didn't like blacks, Demings remembered his father saying. "You could find trouble there." But today, the mayor's twin brother, Terry, lives in Ocoee and owns a business there. Paul Ortiz, a professor of history at the University of Florida said the attack on Ocoee's blacks occurred midway through a series of assaults on black communities by whites between 1917 and 1923, aimed at reinforcing white supremacy. The 6-year span of terror included Red Summer, a phrase coined by civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson to describe the wave of violence which killed hundreds of blacks across the U.S. South, including Tulsa, Elaine, Arkansas, and Rosewood, Florida. In recent years, discussions in Central Florida of the tragedy have more accurately reflected the role racism played, said Rachel Allen, director of the Peace and Justice Institute at Valencia College, which in 2018 hosted 1920 Ocoee and Beyond, Paths to Truth and Reconciliation. Whites called a riot because their perception was blacks were violent, dangerous, needing to be controlled, and they started a riot. Of course, none of which the historical records show was true, she said. The black perception is it was a massacre, a violent attack on a prospering neighborhood. Whites from Orlando and Winter Garden, many with clan ties, came with an intent to disrupt and intimidate and frankly terrorize black leaders who had gained power and standing, and they did just that. But she sees new hope for Ocoee now. They've taken the essential first step, which is admitting the truth, she said. From there, everything's possible. And that's celebrating Black History Month by sharing what's happened in our local area here. And let's hope that history doesn't repeat itself. And the next part three will be the Ukraine invasion by Russia. And I'll share that with you in the next episode. Thank you for continuing to listen on to this episode. Here's part 3, Ukraine invasion by Russia. I want to quickly add that I have friends that are both from Ukraine and Russia, with families still back in those two countries. I pray this war comes to a stop and no more lives are lost, civilian or military personnel. This madness has to stop before it escalates something even more destructive. I will read the latest update from Wikipedia because it has the most summarized version. There are too many social media platforms and news coverages to try to sort through. Here's a title from Wikipedia, 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. This article documents a current military offensive. Information may change rapidly as the event progresses, and initial news reports may be unreliable. The latest updates to this article may not reflect the most current information. But this is as of March 1st. And it says on February 24th, 2022, Russia launched a large-scale military invasion of Ukraine, one of its neighbors, to the southwest, marking a major escalation to a conflict that began in 2014. Following Ukraine's revolution of dignity in 2014, Russia had annexed Crimea, and Russian-backed separatist forces had seized part of the Donbas in eastern Ukraine, leading to an 8-year war in the region. Several officials and analysts call the invasion the largest conventional military attack in Europe since World War II. From early 2021, there was a Russian military buildup around Ukraine's borders. The U.S. and others accused Russia of planning an invasion, but Russian officials repeatedly issued denials. During the crisis, Russian President Vladimir Putin condemned the post-1997 enlargement of NATO as a threat to his country's security, a claim which NATO rejects, and demanded Ukraine be barred from ever joining NATO. Putin expressed Russian irredentist views and questioned Ukraine's right to sovereignty. Before the invasion, in an attempt to provide a casus belli, Putin accused Ukraine of committing genocide against Russian speakers in Ukraine, accusations that are widely described as baseless. On February 21st, 2022, Russia officially recognized the Donetsk, I'm hoping I'm saying it right, Doentsk, and the Luhansk, which is Luhansk, People's Republics, two self-proclaimed states controlled by pro-Russian forces in the Donbass. The following day, Russia's Federal Council unanimously authorized Putin to use military force abroad, and Russia openly sent troops into the breakaway territories. Around 5 o'clock EET on February 24th, Putin announced a special military operation in eastern Ukraine. Minutes later, missiles began to hit locations across Ukraine, including the capital, Kyiv. The State Border Guard Service of Ukraine said that its border posts with Russia and Belarus were attacked. 2 hours later, Russian ground forces entered the country. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky responded by enacting martial law, severing diplomatic ties with Russia, and ordering general mobilization. The invasion received widespread international condemnation, including new sanctions imposed on Russia, triggering a financial crisis. Global protests took place against the invasion, while protests in Russia were met with mass arrests. Both prior to and during the invasion, various states provided Ukraine with foreign aid, including arms and other material support. That was from Wikipedia. I pray and hope through the sharing of these past historical atrocities and the current crisis in Ukraine will shed some light into how we as humans treat one another. The only way the world will change is when we all decide to change. It takes everyone's effort and decision to make this a better place for ourselves, our families, and our neighbors near and far. Instead of letting greed, power, and hatred get in our way, why not use that same energy to find ways to take care of each other, our environment, and create a better world for our future generations? Don't think that one person can make a change. You can. It takes one person to start a trickling effect, pass on words of peace, spread the act of kindness and love, reach out to people in need, and it will cause a chain of reactions. Spread love and positivity every day in all you do, whether it's to yourself, your family members, your neighbors, a post in your social media, your workplace, your place of worship, or just to a stranger when you pass them on a street. Put a smile on someone's face today. Let's make this a better world where we can all accept our uniqueness and respect one another. We only have one life to live. Why not leave a positive impact as your legacy? Thank you for your continued support. I hope you can take something from these stories and sharing of information. We don't know everything, but we can continue to learn something every day. I love sharing what I learn, especially when it applies to us in today's world. I am excited for my next few episodes on celebrating Women's History Month, the month of March. I am a true feminist who wants to empower other women out there to stand up for yourself, go after your dreams, and never settle for anything less than what you deserve. Until the next episode, be well, stay safe, and always be grateful for what you have. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you soon.